A man paid money to take her away. Not because he wanted her, but because nobody else would. She stood in the middle of Red Hollow's main street while the whole town watched, her father's voice cutting through the dry air like a blade. She's barren. She's broken. I'll take any price. No one moved. No one spoke. Until a stranger at the edge of the crowd stepped forward. Not to rescue her, not to love her, but because he needed something warm to fill a cold, dying house. This is the story of a woman who had nothing left to lose and a man who had already lost everything. Stay until the end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The summer Eliza Mercer turned 24, the drought came to Red Hollow like a slow death. It didn't arrive all at once. That was the cruelest part. It crept in over weeks. The sky turning a pale, bleached color, the creek behind the feed store dropping inch by inch until the mud at the bottom cracked like old skin. People started watching the horizon the way sick animals watch a door, waiting for something that didn't come. Wells went dry, gardens turned to powder. The dust settled into everything, into the flour, into the bedding, into the lines carved around people's mouths. And into the Mercer house, the drought had been living for years before it ever touched the land. Eliza knew how to be invisible. She had practiced it so long it had become a kind of skill, the way some women learn to bake or sew. She moved through rooms quietly, spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes low when her father's mood turned dark and hard like the ground outside. She had been married once, briefly, disastrously, to a man named Gerald Payne, who had taken her away with promises that lasted about as long as the wedding flowers. 2 years of a cold bed and colder mornings, and when no children came, Gerald Payne sent her back to her father's house with a single sentence that followed her like a smell she couldn't wash off. The fault is hers. She was 22 when she came back. She was 24 when her father decided he was done carrying her. It was a Tuesday morning when Thomas Mercer told her to put on her good dress. Eliza looked up from the stove where she was stirring a thin pot of corn porridge. Her father was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, already dressed in his church clothes, the dark vest, the hat with the brim he'd reshaped after a bad night of drinking. He was a tall man who had once been strong, but the years had done something unpleasant to him, packed his chest into a barrel shape, and thinned his face until his eyes sat too deep. "What for?" she asked. "Just do it." She changed without asking again. The good dress was blue calico, faded now to something between blue and gray. She had mended the collar twice and the hem once. She braided her hair back because loose hair made her father uncomfortable in a way he'd never explained, and she'd stopped trying to understand. When she came out, he looked her over the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of selling. "That'll do," he said. He didn't speak during the walk into town. Eliza walked beside him and watched the dust rise around her boots with every step, fine and white. And she told herself it was only an errand, maybe the dry goods store, maybe Pritchett's, where he sometimes had credit when his mood was reasonable. She told herself a number of things during that walk that turned out not to be true. Red Hollow wasn't a large town. It had one main street with a face on it, the kind of face that looked almost respectable from a distance, with its painted storefronts and the new church steeple that caught the light in the afternoons. But up close, the paint was peeling. The church had a crack in its foundation that Reverend Adler kept promising to fix. The hotel on the north end smelled of mildew no matter how many times Mrs. Garber aired the rooms. Everything in Red Hollow was fighting a slow losing battle against the heat and the dust and the ordinary wear of hard luck country, and most days it looked like the heat was winning. It was mid-morning on a weekday, but a surprising number of people were already out. Eliza noticed that as they came into the main street, men near the livery, women with baskets outside the dry goods store, a group of older men on the bench in front of the barber shop. Too many people for a regular Tuesday. She felt the small hairs on her arms rise without knowing why. Her father stopped in the middle of the street, not at a store, not at any particular destination, just the middle of the street where everyone could see. He took off his hat and cleared his throat, and Eliza understood in the space of one heartbeat, before a single word left his mouth, what was happening. She understood it the way you understand a fall. Not while you're falling, but in that terrible fraction of a second before you hit. People of Red Hollow, her father said, in a voice she'd never heard him use before. Too loud, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. You all know my daughter Eliza. You know her situation. She was married to Gerald Payne and returned to me after 2 years of marriage, no children, no prospects. I am a man of modest means who cannot continue to carry a burden that doesn't belong to me. Someone near the dry goods store stopped walking. Then another person. Then more. I am offering, he paused, reshaped the hat brim in his hands, a reasonable price to any man willing to take her. She is able-bodied. She can cook, clean, sew. She is 24 years old. She is, he seemed to search for the word, manageable. Silence. Not the polite kind of silence, the kind that has texture, that presses against your skin. Eliza did not move. She stood where she was standing, 3 feet to her father's left, in her faded blue dress. And she felt the eyes of the town move to her like a slow tide coming in. She had spent years learning how to be invisible, and now the one thing she could not do was disappear, though she wanted to more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. She fixed her gaze on a point somewhere past the barbershop, a crack in the wall, a loose board, something that wasn't a face. She heard murmuring. She heard someone laugh, quickly suppressed. She heard a woman's voice say something sharp and low to whoever was standing beside her. The men near the livery shifted. A few exchanged looks. Nobody moved toward her father. Minutes passed. They felt longer than minutes. Thomas Mercer's voice had lost some of its prepared quality when he spoke again. $200. That's a fair price. She'll work hard. A pause. $150. Eliza breathed very slowly through her nose. She kept her gaze on the crack in the barbershop wall. She had learned in Gerald Payne's house that if you cried in front of people, it gave them something they wanted, and she had decided long ago that she would rather die than give this town that particular satisfaction. $125, her father said, and there was something in his voice now that was almost desperate. She's young. She's strong. Any man here could... I'll take her. The voice came from the edge of the crowd, not loud. If anything, it was quieter than the surrounding noise, which was exactly why it cut through everything else the way it did. A voice with no performance in it, just a statement, flat as a board. Eliza turned. She didn't mean to. She had promised herself she wouldn't look at any of them, but she turned because the voice was so entirely different from what she had been bracing for that her body moved before her mind could stop it. The man standing at the edge of the crowd was not what she expected. He wasn't young, somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe edging past that. Not tall in a theatrical way, but solid. The kind of solid that comes from actual work rather than good breeding. He had a face that had been outside in the weather for a long time. Brown, creased around the eyes, a jaw that needed a shave. His clothes were clean but not new. His hat was pulled low. He had the look of a man who had not slept particularly well in some time and had quietly stopped expecting to. He was looking at her father, not at her. "I'll take her," he said again, already moving forward, and the crowd parted around him the way crowds always part around someone who isn't asking permission. What? Thomas Mercer blinked. He hadn't expected anyone to simply step forward without haggling. The prepared script in his head hadn't accounted for that. "Well, the price is $125. "I heard you." The man reached his father, stopped, and pulled money from his coat pocket. He counted it out in a way that suggested he had done arithmetic before the conversation and had come prepared. He held it out. $125. Thomas Mercer took the money. His hands, Eliza noticed, were not entirely steady. The man turned, and for the first time he looked directly at her. His eyes were gray-brown, the color of creek water in autumn. He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, not assessing, not approving or disapproving, just acknowledging. The way you'd acknowledge a person standing in front of you. "I'm Caleb Boone," he said. "I have a ranch 2 hours north. We can leave when you're ready. No question, but also no command. Just information, laid out plainly." Eliza looked at her father. Thomas Mercer was counting the money again. He didn't look at her. She looked back at Caleb Boone. "I need to collect my things." He nodded. "I'll get the wagon." "What?" She had a bag. One bag. A canvas sack she'd had since she was 16, worn soft on the handles. Into it she put 2 dresses, a spare pair of boots with the left heel half resolved, her mother's small mirror with the cracked frame, a book of hymns she never opened but couldn't leave behind, 3 pairs of stockings, a winter shawl. She moved through her father's house collecting these things with a steadiness that surprised her. She had always expected, in whatever vague way she'd let herself imagine leaving, that it would feel like something. Fear, maybe. Or grief. Or even relief. What she felt mostly was numb. She was tying the bag closed when she heard a footstep in the doorway and looked up. It was her father. He was standing with his arms at his sides, the hat still in his hands, and for a moment, one moment, his face had an expression she almost recognized as something human. Eliza. She waited. He looked at the hat brim. You'll be... That man has a good reputation. In terms of... He's not... He stopped, regrouped. He'll treat you decently. You don't know that, she said. Her voice surprised her. Quiet, but very even. You don't know anything about him except that he had 125. Her father's jaw moved. He didn't answer. Eliza picked up her bag. Goodbye, Papa. She walked past him without touching him, out of the house she'd grown up in, down the porch steps, and into the white glare of the summer street, without looking back. The wagon was pulled up at the end of the main street, a solid working vehicle. No frills, some dents, the wood repaired in 2 places with boards that didn't quite match. The horse was a brown gelding with good lines and patient eyes. Caleb Boone was checking the harness when she arrived, and he straightened and took her bag and set it in the back without ceremony, then offered her a hand up into the seat. She took it. His hand was rough. The palm hardened in the specific places that came from rope work and axe handles. He didn't hold on any longer than necessary. He climbed up the other side and clicked to the horse, and they moved. As they passed through the center of Red Hollow, Eliza sat straight in her seat and looked forward. She was aware of faces. She didn't acknowledge them. Somewhere to her left, she heard a woman's voice say her name, and she didn't turn. She would not give this town a face to read. Not today. Not ever again, if she could help it. Red Hollow fell away behind them. The road north unwound through scrub and pale grass, the land flat and wide and brutally honest about its own emptiness. They rode for a while without speaking. Caleb Boone didn't seem uncomfortable with silence. He held the reins with a loose, practiced grip and watched the road and said nothing. And after about 20 minutes, Eliza exhaled a breath she had not known she was holding, a long, slow release, and felt something in her shoulders go loose that had been tight for she couldn't remember how long. You don't have to explain yourself, Caleb said finally. He wasn't looking at her. I don't need to know about your marriage or whatever happened there. None of my business. Eliza looked at his profile. You paid $125 for me. I paid $125 because I need help, he said. Plain and simple. I have 5 children and I can't manage them alone, and the ranch is... He paused, a pause that had something carefully edited out of it. Difficult right now. 5 children. Eldest is 13. Youngest just turned 4. 3 boys, 2 girls. Eliza absorbed this. Their mother? A moment. Passed 18 months ago. Fever. I'm sorry. He nodded once, looking at the road. I'm not asking you to be their mother. I'm asking for help with the house and the cooking and the kids' schooling. Whatever you can manage. In return, you have a roof and food and... He seemed to hunt for the next word and settle on the simplest one. Safety. Eliza thought about the word. Safety. She turned it over in her mind the way you'd turn over something you found in the dirt to check if it was real. What if I'm not good at it? She asked. He glanced at her briefly. Good at what? Any of it. Cooking, children, any of it. He looked back at the road. He seemed to think about this genuinely rather than dismissing it. Then we figure it out as we go, he said. It wasn't reassurance exactly. It wasn't comfort. It was just practical, like everything else he said. But it was also the most honest answer anyone had given her in a very long time, and she found, to her own confusion, that she believed him. The ranch emerged from the flatland 2 hours later the way broken things often do. Slowly, partially, giving you time to prepare yourself. First there was a line of fence posts, some of them leaning, one line flat in the dirt. Then the outline of a barn, solid bones, but the paint worn entirely off on the south side, raw wood showing through like sunburned skin. Then the house itself. It was not what she had imagined. She hadn't let herself imagine much. She'd learned that year by year, hope was expensive, and she'd been running low for a long time. But whatever unformed shape she had expected, it wasn't this. The house was real. 2 stories with a porch. The porch boards had a gap in them near the steps. One window on the upper floor had a piece of oilcloth over it instead of glass. The kitchen garden to the side was a tangle of dead stems. Whatever had been planted there had lost the fight with the drought weeks ago. But it was standing. More than standing, it had been standing for a while. You could see it in the way the house sat in the land, the way the big oak tree to the right had grown around it rather than against it. The wagon stopped, and the front door opened, and 5 children poured out of it. They came in a wave and stopped about 10 feet from the wagon, staring. Eliza looked at them. They looked at her. The eldest, the 13-year-old, was a boy, already rangy, with his father's coloring and a watchfulness in his face that was too old for 13. He stood slightly in front of the others, the way eldest children stand, not exactly protecting them, but marking their territory. Behind him were 2 more boys in descending order, one maybe 10 or 11, built thicker than his brother, scowling without what looked like any particular malice, and one around 8, smaller than his age, with large ears and a gap in his front teeth. The girls were last, one perhaps 6, with tight red-brown braids and a suspicious expression, and the youngest barely 4, round-faced, her dress dirty at the knees, clutching the 6-year-old's hand. The eldest boy looked at his father. "This her?" "This is Miss Eliza," Caleb said, climbing down from the wagon. "Mind your manners." The boy's eyes slid back to Eliza. Not welcoming, not hostile, but calculating. She recognized the expression. It was the expression of a child who had been disappointed before and had stopped giving ground easily. "I'm Will," he said. A flat introduction, not offering anything beyond the name. "Will." She held his gaze. "Nice to meet you." The second boy crossed his arms. "Hector Finch said women who get sold off are trouble." "Sam." Caleb's voice didn't rise, but it had an edge. "What? That's what Hector said." "I don't care what Hector said. Go get Miss Eliza's bag from the wagon." Sam uncrossed his arms slowly, in the way of a boy who wanted his objection on the record, and went to the wagon. The 8-year-old with the gap teeth had been staring at Eliza with increasing intensity. He suddenly announced, "My name's Eli. I broke my arm last winter and it grew back crooked, see?" He thrust out his left arm to display it. "Eli," Will said. "She'd have found out anyway." The 6-year-old, still holding the youngest hand, said nothing and continued to look at Eliza with the quiet devastation of a child who had been making private judgments and had not yet decided whether to share them. "This is Clara," Caleb said, nodding to the 6-year-old. "And the little one is May." May looked at Eliza for a long moment, her round face perfectly serious. Then she held up 2 fingers and announced, "I know how to count to 12. Eliza felt something in her chest do something unexpected. She kept her face composed. "That's more than some men I've met," she said. May's face broke into a grin of startling brightness. Claire's expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a small reduction in visible suspicion. Maybe 2 degrees. The inside of the house told the story more plainly than Caleb had. It was clean. She could see someone had made an effort at clean, but it had the specific disorder of a house being run by people who were too tired to run it properly. There were dishes stacked rather than washed. The floor had been swept but not scrubbed. The curtains were wrong for the windows, hung too high on one side. A shirt was folded on the back of a chair in the front room, with the particular fold of someone who had folded it there 2 weeks ago and had been walking past it ever since. The smell was wood smoke and dust, and something slightly sour she traced to a pot on the stove with something thickened to the bottom. "I'll show you your room," Caleb said. She followed him up the stairs, 12 steps, one of them creaking loudly enough that Eli, coming up behind her, jumped on it deliberately twice. Caleb pushed open the second door on the right and stood back. It was small, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a wooden chest, a window with actual glass that looked out over the north pasture. There was a hook on the wall for her coat and a small oval rug on the floor that had once been colorful and was now mostly beige. Eliza set her bag down on the chest. It's not much, Caleb said behind her. He said it plainly, not apologetically, but the plainness of it contained something. It's more than I had this morning, she said. He seemed to consider that. There's water in the basin, supper's... He stopped. I was going to cook supper. I was planning on salt pork. I'll cook. You don't have to... I'll cook, she said again. Not to be agreeable, because she needed something to do with her hands before the day's accumulated weight settled into her chest and she couldn't move. He nodded and left. She stood alone in the small room for a moment, looking out the window at the dry pasture and the thin strip of sky above the ridge, brownish-orange in the evening light. She breathed. You are in a strange man's house, she told herself. You are 2 hours from the town that just sold you in the street. You have one bag and one faded dress, and you don't know a single one of these people. Then she went downstairs to cook supper. The salt pork was in the cold box. There were also potatoes, thin ones, a little soft, but workable, and dried onion and some cornmeal. She found a cast-iron skillet on the wall hook and got the stove properly going, which required relocating a pile of something she chose not to examine too closely from the wood box. The children came in and out of the kitchen with the particular orbiting motion of children who are curious but don't want to appear so. Sam came to get a cup of water and stayed at the edge of the room for approximately 5 minutes before announcing that she was cutting the potatoes wrong. What's the right way? She asked. He hesitated. He clearly hadn't expected engagement. Mama cut them small, so they cook faster. That's smart, she said. Show me? He went from the doorway to the cutting board in about 3 seconds, took the knife without ceremony, and began cutting with the practiced efficiency of a child who had helped in this kitchen before. Eliza watched and didn't say anything and let him have it. Clara appeared in the doorway with May attached to her hand, as always. She watched the cooking with the kind of attention that wasn't about food. She was measuring something. Eliza wasn't sure exactly what. She didn't push. Will did not appear in the kitchen at all. She heard him outside, the sound of wood being split, regular and methodical, even after the light faded. She didn't comment on it. Supper was not elegant. The potatoes needed more salt and the cornbread was slightly too dry. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and when she set it on the table and the children sat down, the ordinary act of a family sitting down to a meal did something to the air in the kitchen that she felt but couldn't name. Caleb sat at the head of the table. He looked at the food, then at her, and she read something in his expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly. Something close to the feeling of a person who has been holding a heavy thing for a long time and has been allowed to set it down for one moment. Thank you, he said. She sat down and passed the cornbread. Eli ate with the focused commitment of a child who has been waiting for supper since mid-afternoon. May knocked her cup over and didn't cry about it, which Eliza noted. Sam ate quickly and asked for more and said nothing else. Clara ate in careful bites, watching. Will came in from outside, washed his hands, sat down, and ate without speaking. It was not a peaceful meal. Eli argued with Sam about whether a particular frog qualified as a pet or just a temporary resident. Sam took the position of temporary resident with unexpected legal precision. May fell partly off her chair and had to be righted. A piece of cornbread hit the floor and the dog appeared from somewhere to take care of it. Caleb intervened in the frog debate twice. Eliza ate her supper and listened to all of it and didn't say much, but she was listening. She was storing things. The way Sam had a quicker mind than his scowl suggested. The way Clara watched everything. The way May reached for Caleb's hand without looking, just needing to confirm he was there. The way Will ate with his eyes on his plate. Not sullen exactly, but somewhere else, somewhere interior. And the way Caleb looked at each of them, one by one, with a steady and private love that he didn't perform for anyone, that was simply there, as present as the food on the table. She had expected a lot of things from this day. She had not expected this. After supper, she washed the dishes alone. The children scattered. Eli and May were shepherded upstairs by Caleb. Sam disappeared outside. Clara sat in the front room with a slate and wrote things on it with painstaking care. Will had gone out again. Through the window, Eliza could see him at the fence, standing in the last light, looking out at the dry pasture. She was drying the last pot when she heard a sound from upstairs. Not a big sound, a small one, a child crying. She set the pot down. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. The crying was thin and high. May, she thought. She heard Caleb's low voice speaking quietly, and the crying continued underneath it. She wasn't sure what made her go up. She wasn't the child's mother, and she had been in this house for less than 4 hours, and she had no claim on anything here. She went up anyway. Caleb was sitting on the edge of May's bed, the little girl curled into his side, both small fists clutching his shirt. May's face was wet and red, the specific ugly crying of very young children who can't contain it. Caleb looked up when Eliza appeared in the doorway. "She gets like this sometimes at night," he said. His voice was tired but gentle. "I think it's the dark. Or, I don't know, something." Eliza looked at May. May looked at Eliza with her wet, miserable face. "I can sit with her," Eliza said, "if you have things to do." "I don't want to push her on you. You're not pushing, I'm offering." She came into the room and sat on the other side of the bed. May, somewhat uncertainly, looked between them. Then she reached out and put one wet hand on Eliza's arm. "Cold," May said. "I know," Eliza said. "It's all right." She started humming. Not a song she knew the name of, something her mother had hummed, low and unstructured, more a sound than a melody. May's fists unclenched slowly. Her breathing hitched twice and then began to even out. Caleb watched this without moving. After a while, he very quietly got up, and Eliza heard him go down the hall and down the stairs, the treads creaking under his boots. She sat with May until the little girl's hand went slack and her breathing deepened into sleep. Then she sat a while longer just to make sure. The room was warm and very quiet. Through the thin wall, she could hear Eli murmuring something to himself. Stories he told himself in bed, she'd learn later, elaborate adventures that helped him settle. She thought about Red Hollow and the white glare of the main street, and her father's voice counting down the price of her like something at auction. She thought about Gerald Payne's cold house and the way silences in that house had teeth. She looked at the small sleeping face of May. She stood up, adjusted the child's blanket, and went back downstairs. Caleb was at the kitchen table with a lantern and a stack of papers. Ledgers, she saw, accounts of some kind. He looked up when she came in. "She's asleep," Eliza said. "Thank you." He said it with the simplicity of someone who meant it exactly and didn't need to say more. She poured herself a cup of water and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the dark. Somewhere out there, Will was still at the fence or had gone inside. She couldn't tell now. "He was the oldest when their mother died," Caleb said. She turned. He was looking at the ledger but not at it. "Will, he was 12. He took it a certain way. Boys that age, they think they should be able to fix things. He couldn't fix it, and I think he's still, He stopped. "I don't know exactly what he is. Still working it out." Eliza held her cup and said nothing for a moment. "You don't have to explain them to me." "I know, He rubbed his jaw. "They're going to be hard on you. Will, especially. I'm not excusing it. I just want you to know it's not personal. It can't be personal. They don't know you well enough for it to be personal." "I know that." "Right." He looked back at his papers. "You should sleep. It's a hard first day." "Every day's been hard lately," she said. "I'll manage." She set her cup down and went upstairs. She lay in the narrow bed under the faded quilt and listened to the ranch settle around her. The distant sound of the horse in the barn, the slow tick of the house cooling, Eli's murmuring finally fading into silence. The room was warm. The quilt smelled like lavender, faint and old, the ghost of someone else's care. She thought she would not sleep. Her mind was too full of the day, too loud with everything that had happened in it. She was asleep before she had finished the thought. 3 days passed before she made her first real mistake. She had been managing, not triumphantly but functionally, which was all she'd promised herself. The meals improved each day as she learned the stove's habits and figured out what was actually in the dry goods cabinet versus what appeared to be in it. May followed her everywhere with a silent, determined loyalty that Eliza was careful not to encourage too directly because she knew how fragile new attachments were. Eli had adopted her as a primary audience for his injury disclosures, which now apparently included a dislocated thumb, a possible concussion from 1874, and something he described as a fever of the brain that Caleb said was a cold. Sam warmed by degrees. He couldn't help it. He was the kind of boy who needed to be useful. and Eliza kept finding him opportunities to be exactly that without appearing to do so on purpose. Clara remained watchful and quiet and close to her own interior, and Eliza left her space. Will spoke to her for necessary communications only. He wasn't rude. He was careful not to be rude, which she recognized as a form of effort, and she respected it in the way she'd respect anyone who was trying. The mistake happened on the morning of the fourth day. She had been trying to find the good mixing bowl, the ceramic one Sam had pointed out that first evening, and she'd been going through the kitchen shelves and found it, wedged behind a stack of tin plates. She'd also found, tucked beside it, a small bundle of cloth carefully tied with string. She took it out without thinking, unwrapped it. Inside were folded pieces of paper, a woman's handwriting she could see from a glance, letters or notes, and a small brooch, silver with a chipped blue stone. She heard a sound in the doorway. Will was standing there. He had come in from outside, she could tell by the state of his boots. And he was looking at the bundle in her hands with an expression that Eliza had never seen on a 13-year-old's face before, and hoped she would never see again. She put it down on the table immediately. "I was looking for the bowl. I didn't know." "That's Mama's." His voice was flat and stripped of everything except the flatness. "I know, I'm sorry. I put it right down. I didn't." "You shouldn't be going through things." Still flat, still controlled, but under it, something that was going to break if you pressed on it, and she could see it, and she stepped back from it. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry." He came in, carefully picked up the bundle, rewrapped it, and tied the string back exactly the way it had been. He picked it up with both hands and walked out without looking at her. Eliza stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she found the mixing bowl, set it on the counter, and started on breakfast. That evening, Caleb said, "Will told me about the bundle." "I know, I didn't mean to. I'll be more careful." "You don't need to." "He's not angry with you exactly." "He's protective," she said. "That makes sense." Caleb looked at his hands, flat on the table. She kept things in odd places. Rebecca did, said she liked things where she could find them. He paused. "Sometimes I still reach for her, in the night. 18 months and I still reach for her." Eliza looked at him. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was just saying a true thing, quietly, the way certain true things needed to be said once so they didn't take up so much room. "That doesn't go away fast," she said. "No." He stood up and went to the window. "I know what this looks like, what I did. Buying a woman in the street, I know it." His back was to her. I wasn't thinking about, I just saw a person being humiliated and I knew I needed help and it seemed like." He stopped. "Practical," she said. A pause. "I was going to say wrong, actually." He turned around. "What I did. It was still wrong even if it worked out. You deserved better than that." She hadn't expected it. The apology, if that's what it was. The acknowledgement. She sat with it for a moment. "So did you," she said finally. "Deserve better, not having to look for help in the middle of a street." He looked at her. She looked back. "We're in a strange situation," he said. "We are," she agreed. "I think we can manage it." "I think so too." He nodded and went back to his papers. She picked up her mending. Outside, somewhere, the horse made a comfortable sound in the barn, and the night insects began their chorus in the dry grass, and the house settled around its strange new arrangement of people and tried to make room. The first week bled into the second, and the second into the third, and somewhere in that stretch of days, Eliza stopped counting them. Not because things got easier, they didn't, not exactly, but because the counting stopped being useful. You can mark time when you're waiting for something. When you're just surviving, you keep your head down and you move. The drought was not improving. Every morning she woke to the same bleached sky, the same dry heat pressing in through the window glass before the sun had properly cleared the ridge. The creek that ran along the south edge of the property had dropped to a trickle. Caleb checked it every few days, coming back with the same look on his face. The kind that said the news was bad, and he'd already known it would be. The water barrel at the side of the house had to be rationed. She learned to cook with less, to wash dishes in a pan and save the gray water for the dying kitchen garden, to rinse the children's clothes in a bucket and hang them before the heat could sour them. The kitchen garden was, by any reasonable measure, a lost cause. The previous planting, whoever had put it in, she suspected it had been Rebecca, had given up weeks before Eliza arrived. Dead stems, cracked soil, a single withered herb plant still stubbornly upright in the corner like it hadn't gotten the message. The sensible thing was to let it go until the rains came, if the rains came. Everyone on the neighboring properties had made exactly that calculation and moved on. Eliza did not move on. She couldn't have explained it exactly. Stubbornness, partly. The same quality that had kept her spine straight in the middle of Red Hollow's main street. But also something else. Something about the garden's refusal to admit defeat that she recognized from the inside. She started working it in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, before the children were fully awake, clearing the dead growth and breaking the crusted soil with a hand fork she found in the barn. Her hands blistered by the third day. She wrapped the blisters with strips cut from an old pillowcase and kept going. She planted what she had, a few seeds from the dry goods store in town, tomatoes and squash, and a little row of beans along the south-facing fence. She watered them with the dishwater and the laundry water, and sometimes with water she carried from the creek herself in 2 buckets hung from a yoke she found in the barn. The yoke left marks on her shoulders. She didn't mention them. Caleb noticed anyway. "You don't have to do that," he said one morning, watching her come back from the creek with the buckets. He was at the fence, fixing a broken post, and he straightened when he saw her. "I know. The garden's probably not going to—" He stopped. "Probably not," she agreed, setting the buckets down. "But it might?" He looked at her for a moment. That way he had, brief and direct, saying more in 2 seconds than most men said in a full conversation. Then he picked up his fencing tools and went back to work without another word. But 2 days later she found a second yoke hung on the barn wall beside the first, and the buckets had been redistributed so the weight balanced better. She didn't say anything about that either. The children were their own separate education. May was the simplest and the most exhausting. 4 years old, which meant she had no internal filter between thought and action, and an attachment to Eliza that had developed so fast and so completely that it sometimes felt like a weight around her ankles, though she couldn't say so. May followed her from room to room. May appeared at the kitchen doorway at 5:30 in the morning, still soft and warm from sleep, demanding to know what Eliza was doing and why and whether she could help. May climbed into her lap at odd moments without asking. She wasn't gentle about it. She was a solid, physical child who approached affection like a small, determined animal and simply occupied whatever space she'd decided was hers. Eliza was careful with herself around May. She was careful not to pull away and not to pull too close. She didn't know yet what this arrangement was going to become, and she had learned the hard way that attachments built on uncertain ground could collapse in ways that left marks. But it was hard to be careful when May fell asleep against her arm on the porch steps one evening, her breath going soft, her weight trusting and complete. It was hard to be careful then. Eli was easier, in the sense that he made no secret of anything. By the end of the second week, he had cataloged for her every injury he'd ever sustained, described in detail his theories about why the south pasture well tasted different from the north pasture well, introduced her to the frog Sam had declared a temporary resident, but who appeared to be living permanently in a tin pail behind the barn, and asked her 17 questions about her previous life that she answered as honestly as she could without getting into the parts that still had sharp edges. "Did you have kids before?" he asked once, without particular delicacy, while she was teaching him to write his letters on the slate. "No." "How come?" She kept her eyes on the slate. "Sometimes it just doesn't happen." "Oh." He considered this. "Sam says you couldn't, and that's why your husband sent you back." Sam heard that in town. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "I think Sam says a lot of things he doesn't mean. He does that when he's scared." Eliza looked at him. 8 years old, gap-toothed, entirely guileless. "That's a perceptive thing to say." "What's perceptive?" "Smart. You notice something true." He seemed pleased with this in a private way, turning back to his letters without making a show of it. But he held the chalk more carefully after that, and he tried harder, and she understood that she had given him something with the word smart that she hadn't known she was giving. Sam's thawing was slower and had its own particular pattern. He made objections about how she cut the potatoes, about which pot she used for beans, about the way she organized the dry goods shelf. Some of the objections were actually useful. He knew this kitchen better than she did, knew its rhythms, knew where his mother had kept things, and how. And she genuinely deferred to him when he was right, which was often enough that he stopped bracing for dismissal and started offering the information more directly. She kept the cornmeal in the tin with the red lid, he said one afternoon, watching her dig through the shelf. Not the blue one. Blue one's got weevils. Good to know. She found the red tin. You know this kitchen well. I helped her. Before. He said before with the careful vagueness of someone who hadn't decided yet how much weight the word was allowed to carry. She let me cook sometimes. Real cooking, not just stirring. Show me something you know how to make. He blinked. What? Show me something. We'll make supper together. He didn't say yes immediately. He thought about it. She could see him thinking, turning it over, checking for some trap or condescension she might have hidden in the offer. He found nothing because there was nothing. She had a way of doing salt pork with the onion and some dried pepper, he said finally. It's better than just frying it straight. Then show me. He did. And it was genuinely better. She told him so and meant it, and he looked at his plate and ate 3 portions without speaking, and she counted that as a kind of progress. Clara remained the one she couldn't read. 6 years old and already so contained, so careful with herself, that Eliza sometimes wondered what had happened to make a child that age build walls so precisely. She wasn't unfriendly. She responded when spoken to, did what was asked of her, helped with May with a quiet competency that was startling in a child her age. But she watched Eliza with those dark, considering eyes and gave nothing away. And after 2 weeks, Eliza had learned very little about what was happening inside her, except that a great deal was. The breakthrough, if you could call it that, came on a Tuesday night during the worst rainstorm of the month. It wasn't a long storm, but it was a violent one, the kind that came out of nowhere and hit the house broadside. Lightning cracking the sky in sheets. Thunder so close it vibrated the window glass. May woke up screaming. Eliza was already moving before she was fully conscious. 4 weeks in this house, and she had grown attuned to its sounds in ways that surprised her, the way certain sounds required immediate response. She got to May's room quickly and gathered the child and sat with her on the bed, humming, rocking slightly. May calmed. The storm did not. She became aware, after a while, that Clara was sitting in the doorway. Not crying, not asking for anything, just sitting in the doorway with her blanket pulled around her shoulders, watching the window, the lightning reflecting in her eyes at intervals. Come in, Eliza said quietly, careful not to make it a question. Clara came in. She sat on the other side of the bed, the blanket around her like a shell, and didn't say anything. Eliza kept humming, May warm and heavy against her side. The storm moved overhead and began to pass, the thunder spacing out, the rain tapering. After a long silence, Clara said, She used to do that. Eliza waited. When it stormed, Clara's voice was very small and very precise. She'd come in and sit with us. She didn't say much. She just was here. Eliza looked at the 6-year-old's profile in the dark. Your mama. Yeah. The rain pattered on the roof, gentler now. May had fallen back toward sleep. Eliza kept very still, not wanting to disturb whatever had opened in the room. I don't want a new mama, Clara said. The words were measured, not hostile, just honest, with the particular honesty of a child who has decided on the truth before speaking it. I want the real one back. I know you can't do that. I just want you to know. I know, Eliza said. That makes sense. So, Clara pulled her blanket tighter. I just wanted to say that, so it's not confusing. I appreciate that. A long quiet. Then Clara lay down on May's other side, still wrapped in her blanket, and closed her eyes. She was asleep within minutes. Eliza sat between the 2 girls in the dark and listened to the rain finish its work, and she understood that Clara had just done her the enormous courtesy of telling her exactly where they stood. It wasn't welcome exactly, but it was honest, and from Clara, honesty was the only currency that meant anything. Will was the harder case. Will was 13 and carrying things that were too heavy for 13 and knew it and was furious about it in a way he'd compressed into something quiet and controlled that was actually harder to watch than rage would have been. He worked. That was the thing about Will. He worked with a ferocity that his father matched but didn't ask for, out on the fence lines and in the barn, before school time, after school time, on the weekends. He didn't complain. He didn't perform the labor. He just did it, with his head down and his jaw set. She found him one afternoon in the barn after the younger children were asleep. He was repairing a piece of harness leather by lantern light, and he looked up when she came in and then looked back at the work. She sat on a hay bale near the door. She didn't have a particular reason for being there except that she'd been restless and the house felt close that night. "You don't have to keep me company," he said. "I'm not. I came to sit." She picked up a piece of straw and turned it in her fingers. "You can keep working." He kept working. The lantern threw warm shadows. The horse moved in his stall with a comfortable shifting sound. After a while, Will said, without looking up, "You're not going to leave, are you?" It wasn't entirely a question. "Not planning to," she said. "Last woman Pa hired to help, after Mama died, she lasted 6 weeks, said it was too isolated. I'm not her." He glanced up briefly. "I know." Back to the harness. "I'm not. I want you to know that I don't hate you. I know I'm not. Easy." "You're not hard either," she said. "You're grieving. That's different." He set the harness down in his lap and looked at the lantern for a moment. "She'd have liked you," he said finally, like it cost him something to say it. "Mama, she liked people who didn't fold." Eliza held that carefully, not wanting to press on it. "She sounds like she was good. She was the best person I ever knew." Simple and flat. So, Eliza agreed. He picked up the harness again. She sat with him until the lantern burned low, and when she got up to go inside, she said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and it was, she thought, as close to a truce as they were going to get for now. It was enough. Caleb came down with something in the 5th week. Not the fever she'd been quietly dreading, but a bad chest cold that settled in and refused to move, leaving him coughing through the nights and dragging through the days with the gray-faced determination of a man who has too much to do to acknowledge that he is sick. She watched him for 2 days, and on the 3rd morning, when he came down to breakfast, still coughing, and announced he was going to ride out to check the south fence, she put herself between him and the door. "No," she said. He stopped. He seemed genuinely surprised. "I beg your pardon?" "The fence will be there tomorrow. You're going back to bed." He looked at her with an expression that contained several things at once: irritation, disbelief, a flicker of something she couldn't read. "The fence? Sam and I will walk the south fence this afternoon. Eli can come. Will is already out on the north side. The fence will get checked. You will go upstairs." "This is my ranch." "It is, and you're running it sick, which means you'll run it into the ground before spring. Go to bed." A long moment. Caleb looked at her and she looked back at him, and neither of them moved. She was aware that this was a test of something she hadn't named yet between them, some question of authority and partnership and mutual respect that they hadn't had a formal conversation about and might never have. He went to bed. She made a poultice from the things she had, mustard powder, cloth, a little heat, and brought it up without comment. She made broth from what was available, thin but hot, and brought that too. He slept most of 2 days and woke on the 3rd with clearer color and the look of a man who has been forced to rest and discovered, privately, that he needed it more than he'd known. "Thank you," he said, coming down on the 3rd morning. "You're welcome." He sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she put in front of him. "You've been managing everything. The kids helped. Sam knows more about this place than he admits." "He does." Caleb drank his coffee. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not good at being looked after." "I noticed. Rebecca used to say I had the stubbornness of a man who'd been wrong once and never gotten over it." The corners of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. The memory of a smile that used to live there. Eliza poured her own coffee and sat down across from him. Outside, she could hear Eli already up and arguing with the chickens about something. May was still asleep. For a moment, the kitchen was quiet in a way it rarely was. Just the two of them, the coffee, the early light coming through the window. "The garden's doing something," she said. He looked up. "The tomato plants. 2 of them. She'd checked that morning before he came down. I don't know if they'll hold. The soil's still too dry, but they're up." He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up from the table, moved to the window, and looked out at the kitchen garden. She watched his back, the line of his shoulders, which had had a particular tension in them for weeks, held there by the drought and the sickness and the weight of 5 children and a ranch that was slowly losing its fight with the sky. His shoulders, very slightly, came down. "Well," he said. "Yeah," she said. He turned around and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not hope exactly, because hope was too simple a word for it, and it was mixed with too many other things. But something that had not been there before the window and was there now. "I'll help you with the water tomorrow," he said. "The yoke. You shouldn't be carrying it alone." She didn't argue. "All right." He sat back down. She refilled his coffee. Outside, Eli's argument with the chickens had escalated, and May appeared at the kitchen doorway with her hair completely undone, blinking in the light, reaching automatically for Eliza's arm as she passed. The morning began. It was hard, and it was imperfect, and there were 3 things that went wrong before noon, but it was real, and it was theirs, and somewhere under all of it, something fragile and determined was working its way upward through the cracked soil, the same way the tomato plants were. Slowly, against considerable odds, refusing to read the signs that said it was too late. The trip to Red Hollow had been Caleb's idea, which didn't make it a good one. They needed supplies. That part was undeniable. The dry goods were running low in ways that rationing could only stretch so far, and the ranch account at Pritchett's store needed settling before the month turned. He'd been putting it off, partly because of the chest cold, and partly because of the unspoken understanding between them that Red Hollow was a place with a long memory and not much charity. But the list on the kitchen shelf kept growing, and one morning at breakfast he set his coffee down and said, "I need to go into town Friday. You should come." Eliza looked at him across the table. "You don't need me for that." "No, but the children need new boots measured, and Mrs. Garber at the dry goods has to see the person doing the ordering before she'll extend the account." He said it plainly, not dressing it up. "And I think," he paused, "I think it's better if we go together." She understood what he meant. She had been on the ranch for 7 weeks. 7 weeks was long enough for Red Hollow to have built a story about them, and that story would not be flattering. Going in alone, either of them, would be worse than going in together. "All right," she said. They went Friday. Will stayed with the younger children. At 13, he was reliable in ways that mattered, and he'd done it before. And Caleb and Eliza took the wagon in on the morning road with the sun still low and the air, for once, almost bearable. The drive was quieter than their first one had been. Not uncomfortable, they had reached over 7 weeks, a kind of ease with each other's silences that couples who'd been married for years sometimes didn't find. Eliza watched the land pass, and Caleb watched the road, and occasionally one of them said something practical about the supply list or the state of the road or hawks sitting on a fence post, and the rest of the time they just occupied the same space without needing to fill it. She was not, she told herself, nervous. She was absolutely nervous. Red Hollow appeared the same way it always did, false-faced, sun-bleached, the church steeple catching the light in a way that looked more hopeful than the town deserved. Caleb brought the wagon down the main street, and she sat beside him with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the town the way you watch a dog you're not sure about. The first looks came from outside the barber shop. 2 men she recognized, old Carol with the tobacco-stained beard, and someone younger she didn't know by name, who stopped talking when the wagon passed and watched it with the focused attention of people who have been discussing something and have just seen that something arrive. Pritchett's store was midway down the main street. Caleb tied the horse and helped her down. A small gesture, automatic on his part, but she was aware of it in the way you're aware of gestures that have an audience. And they went inside. Margaret Pritchett was behind the counter, a narrow woman in her 50s with good posture and the ability to communicate complex social judgments through the arrangement of her facial features alone. She looked at Eliza when they came in. The look was not warm. It was not actively hostile. It was the particular look of a woman who had already decided something and was confirming it. "Mr. Boone," she said, then with a half-beat delay, "Miss Mercer." "Mrs. Boone now, actually," Caleb said, calm and matter-of-fact, the way he said most things. "We married quietly. I think you know why." Eliza kept her expression still. This was the first she'd heard the word married used. They had not formalized anything. There had been no ceremony, but she understood immediately what Caleb was doing and why, and she let it stand. Margaret Pritchett's expression shifted slightly. Whatever she had prepared to say rearranged itself into something more careful. "Of course," she said. "What can I get you?" They worked through the list. Caleb did most of the talking: cornmeal, salt, lamp oil, the boot measurements for the children that required a brief and surprisingly civil negotiation with Margaret Pritchett over sizing. And Eliza moved through the store gathering what she could find on the shelves, aware the whole time of Margaret Pritchett's eyes following her with the patient attention of a woman filing information away. She was at the back shelf, looking for the particular dried pepper Sam had requested when she heard the door open and a voice she recognized the way you recognize a smell that makes you sick. "Well, I didn't believe it when I heard." She turned slowly. Adeline Payne was 22 years old, blonde, visibly pregnant, and wearing a dress that cost more than anything in Eliza's canvas bag. She was Gerald Payne's new wife, married 8 months after he'd sent Eliza back, and she stood in the doorway of Pritchett's store with the specific confidence of a woman who knows she has an audience and has decided to use it. Behind her, Gerald Payne came in. He was a year older than Eliza remembered, or maybe just looked it. He'd always had a softness to him that she'd once mistaken for gentleness, and had learned was just the absence of spine. He looked at Eliza and then away, and the looking away was its own kind of statement. "Eliza Mercer," Adeline said. She put a hand on her belly, not unconsciously. "I heard you found someone who'd have you after all." The store was quiet. Margaret Pritchett had gone very still behind the counter. Eliza did not move from the back shelf. She held the dried pepper in her hand and looked at Adeline Payne and thought very clearly, "I am not going to do this today." "Adeline," she said, neutral as a floorboard. "We all thought it was so sad," Adeline continued, moving into the store with the practiced ease of a woman who has never questioned her right to take up space. "Gerald always said you tried your best. Didn't you, Gerald?" She looked back at her husband, who produced a sound that was technically agreement. "Some women just aren't suited for it. Nobody's fault." "Adeline." Gerald's voice was low and warning. "What?" "I'm just saying." She looked back at Eliza with an expression of performed sympathy so thin you could see straight through it. "I heard you were out at the Boone place. 5 children, all that drought. That must be hard work for you." "It is," Eliza said. "Well?" Adeline patted her belly again. "Gerald and I are we're so happy. I imagine it must be difficult to see. We don't want you to feel..." "That's enough." Caleb had come from the front of the store. He moved quietly. She'd noticed that about him, the way a big man can move without announcing himself. And he stopped at Eliza's shoulder. He wasn't looking at Adeline Payne. He was looking at Gerald, with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely serious, which was somehow more effective than anger would have been. "You're Gerald Payne," he said. Not a question. Gerald straightened slightly, the instinct of a man who recognizes he's being assessed. "I am. I've heard about you." Caleb's voice was level. "From my wife." Another beat of quiet in the store. Gerald Payne's jaw worked. Caleb turned to Adeline then, and his voice didn't change, didn't heat up, didn't perform anything for the room. "My wife came into this store to buy supplies, that's all. If you have something you need to say to her, I'd ask you to think about whether you actually need to say it." Adeline's face flushed. She opened her mouth and seemed to recalculate. Whatever she'd come in rehearsing didn't have a response built in for the specific flatness of Caleb Boone's tone. I was only making conversation," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "We're finished now." He put his hand on the small of Eliza's back. Not possessive, not a performance, just present. And turned back to the counter. After a moment, Eliza followed him, and she felt the heat in her face slowly settling. She heard Adeline say something to Gerald behind them, low and indignant. She didn't catch the words. She didn't try. They settled the account and collected the supplies and loaded them into the wagon with the efficient quiet of people who have something to process but are choosing not to do it yet. As Caleb was tying down the last of the load, Eliza stood at the horse's head and scratched behind his ear and breathed. "Thank you," she said when Caleb came around the front. "I didn't do much." "You did enough." He looked at her directly. He had a habit of doing that, looking at her with a directness that most people reserved for conversations they'd been rehearsing. What she said in there. About you not being suited. That's... I know what it is, Eliza said. I was going to say it's wrong. A pause. You're more suited for this kind of life than most people I've known. Men included. She looked back at the horse. The afternoon light was harsh and white, making hard shadows of everything. You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it because I have to. He was quiet for a moment, then... 6 weeks ago, those children were eating burnt salt pork every night, and Will was trying to hold the house together with his hands, and Sam was pretending he didn't know how scared he was. That's different now. You did that. She didn't answer for a moment. She wasn't sure she trusted her voice to be entirely steady. They did most of it themselves. With you, he said. That's the point. She looked at him. He looked back. In the white afternoon light on Red Hollow's main street, with the supplies loaded and the horse patient and the town doing its ordinary business around them, something shifted between them. Not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement, just a small, permanent movement, like a door that had been slightly ajar swinging fully open. Neither of them said anything about it. They had been driving back for about half an hour, the town behind them and the ranch road ahead, when Caleb pulled the wagon up short at the tree line where the road bent north. Wait here, he said quietly. She followed his gaze. Ahead, where the road narrowed between the tree line and the fence, a man was sitting on a fallen log beside the road, not waiting for a wagon. He had the loose, unfocused posture of someone who had been drinking since before noon, and even from this distance she could see the unsteadiness in the way he sat. He looked up when the wagon stopped. Eliza didn't recognize him at first. A broad man, heavy through the shoulders, with a trapper's gear bundled beside the log. Then he stood, and she placed him. Denny Walsh. She'd seen him in Red Hollow 3 or 4 times. A man who moved through the territory seasonally and spent his town time doing 2 things, selling pelts and drinking up the money. Boone, Walsh said, squinting into the light. Then his eyes moved to Eliza and stayed there with the particular focus of a man whose judgment has been seriously impaired. And the Mercer woman. Heard you took her on. We're passing through, Walsh, Caleb said. Sure you are. Walsh took a step toward the wagon. He was smiling in a way that had nothing pleasant in it. Just want to say hello to the lady. Your daddy sold you in the street, didn't he? He addressed this to Eliza directly. Like at the cattle auction. How much'd you go for? Get off the road, Caleb said. I'm having a conversation. Walsh came another step closer, his eyes still on Eliza. Woman sold in the street. That's interesting to me. Makes a man wonder what she's worth. Eliza sat still. She had learned in Gerald Payne's house and before that in her father's how to make herself a smaller target. She'd gotten very good at it. She sat still now and kept her eyes forward and calculated distances. How close Walsh was, whether the road was wide enough to go around him, what the horse would do if the situation escalated. Last time, Caleb said. Walsh reached up and put his hand on the wagon board just below where Eliza was sitting. Not touching her, just there. The proximity of it. Come on now, your man can wait. What happened next was fast. Caleb came off the wagon seat in a single movement. Not climbing down, just moving, the way large men can sometimes move when they've stopped calculating and started acting. Walsh turned and got one hand up before Caleb hit him. A single punch, short and decisive, the kind that comes from the shoulder and has everything behind it. Walsh went down hard and stayed down, his back against the fallen log, blinking at the sky. Caleb stood over him. He was breathing hard but controlled. The breathing of a man who is angry and is keeping the anger on a leash because it serves him better that way. I'll say this once, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. Don't come near my wife. Don't come near my property. Don't say her name in a bar or on a road or anywhere else in this territory. He paused. You understand me? Walsh, on the ground, looked up at him with the careful expression of a man reassessing a situation he'd badly misjudged. He nodded. Caleb came back to the wagon and climbed up and picked up the reins. They drove. For a while, neither of them spoke. The road unrolled through the pale grass, the afternoon light going gold at the edges, the horses' hooves raising small puffs of dust with every step. Then Eliza said, Your hand. He looked at it. The knuckle was split, bleeding slightly. It's fine. Let me see it when we get back. Eliza, let me see it, she said. Firm, not asking. A pause. All right. She looked at the road ahead. Her heart was still moving faster than normal, a body reaction she hadn't allowed herself to show, and was only letting herself notice now that it was over. Not just the fear of Walsh, though that had been real, the physicality of it, the hand on the wagon board. More than that, nobody had ever done what Caleb had done. In 24 years, no one had stepped between her and something dangerous and said no, not her. Gerald Payne had watched his own mother say terrible things to her across a dinner table and pass the bread. Her father had put her on a street for the town to inspect. She had built, over years, a thorough understanding of what she was worth to the people who were supposed to protect her. Caleb hadn't protected her because she was his property. She could see the difference. He'd protected her because, the thought arrived without her calling for it, because she was a person, and it was wrong. And he was a man who, when something was wrong in front of him, did something about it. It was such a simple thing, such an ordinary, basic human thing. She hadn't known it would hit her the way it did. She didn't say any of this. She folded it up very carefully and put it somewhere interior, somewhere she could look at later when she was alone. She watched the road and felt the sun going warm on her face and listened to the rhythm of the horse's hooves on the dry ground. At the ranch, Will came out to help with the supplies. He looked at Caleb's hand immediately. Sharp-eyed, that boy, always. And then at Eliza, and she gave him a small nod that said, "It's handled, everyone's fine." He accepted that without pushing and started carrying boxes. She cleaned and bandaged Caleb's knuckle at the kitchen table while the children ate supper in the next room. He sat still for it, which she'd half expected him to fight. She worked with the carbolic and the clean cloth, and he watched her hands. "You're good at that," he said. "I've had practice. Eli alone has given me considerable practice." The corner of his mouth moved. "That's fair." She tied off the bandage and smoothed it flat. His hand was large and rough and warm under hers, and she became aware suddenly that she had been holding it for several minutes and that neither of them had moved. She let go. "Thank you," she said. "For today. Both times." He looked at her with those gray-brown eyes. "Don't thank me for that." "Caleb, I mean it. That's not... You don't thank someone for doing what's right." He said it simply, without weight or drama. "That's just what you do." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm behind them, supper sounds drifting through, May's voice rising above the others with some declarative statement about counting. "All right," Eliza said quietly. She stood up and put the medical things away and began clearing the supper dishes, and Caleb sat at the table a while longer before he moved, and if either of them was carrying something they hadn't been carrying that morning, neither of them said so. But it was there, solid and new, the way things are when they've been decided without a single word being spoken. Something had been settled between them on that road and in that store and at that kitchen table, and the ranch felt different for it when the lights went out that night. Less temporary, less like an arrangement, and more like a life. Outside, the dry grass moved in a rare evening breeze, and the tomato plants in the kitchen garden held their ground. July arrived like a verdict. The territory had seen dry summers before. Every old-timer within 50 miles had a story about the drought of 67 or the bad stretch in 71, but this one was different in the way that made even the old-timers go quiet. The creek on the south edge of the Boone property stopped running entirely in the first week of the month. Not slowed, stopped. One morning there was a trickle, and the next morning there was just a channel of cracked mud with a smell like old pennies. Caleb stood at the edge of it for a long time without saying anything, and when he came back to the house, his face had the look of a man doing arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. The well held. That was something. But the water table was dropping. You could hear it in the way the pump handle required more effort each morning, a deeper pull, like the water was retreating from them personally. Caleb started rationing in ways he hadn't before, and he didn't make an announcement about it, just quietly shifted things. The livestock got less. The washing got less. The kitchen garden got what was left, which wasn't much. Eliza doubled the dishwater runs anyway. She was up before 5 most mornings now, working the garden while the air was still bearable, hauling what water she could from the well with the careful rationing of someone who understood that every cup mattered. The tomato plants, the 2 that had come up in defiance of everything, were still alive. Barely. They were yellow-green where they should have been dark, and the soil around them cracked between waterings, and every morning she examined them with the specific attention of a person whose investment is too high to be casual. "They're still there," Eli reported one morning, crouching beside the plants with the solemn authority of an 8-year-old who has appointed himself chief scientific observer. "Both of them. I checked." "I know. I checked before you." "The left one looks worse." "The left one always looks worse. It's still growing." He stood up and squinted at her. "Why do you care so much about these particular tomatoes?" She considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned Eli required. He didn't like deflection. "Because everybody told me they wouldn't grow," she said, "and I don't like being told what won't work." He thought about this. "Pa's like that too," he said. "He fixed the south fence 3 times, and everyone said it was too far gone." Then he wandered off to conduct further scientific observations elsewhere, and Eliza went back to the well with the bucket. The heat built through the days like pressure in a sealed room. By midday, the air shimmered over the dry grass, and the barn roof ticked and expanded in the sun, and the children moved slower, grew shorter-tempered, argued about things that weren't worth arguing about. May stopped eating properly. The heat killed her appetite, and she'd pick at her food and push it around, and Eliza had taken to making her a cold porridge in the mornings that she'd eat most of before losing interest. Clara got headaches. Eli got a rash on his arms from the dry heat that he described in clinical detail, and scratched despite being told not to. Sam said very little, which meant he was scared. She'd learned his pattern, talkative when things were manageable, quiet when they weren't. He worked alongside Caleb in the afternoons, and she'd see them at the fence or in the barn, the boy matching his father's pace with the focused effort of someone who has decided that work is the only answer to fear. She didn't try to pull him from it. It was honest, and it was useful, and sometimes that was enough. Will had gotten harder to read as the summer deepened. He did everything right. Worked, helped, looked after the younger ones, spoke when spoken to. But there was something in him that had pulled back, some interior place he'd retreated to that she couldn't reach, and she knew better by now than to force it. She gave him space and she gave him work, and she trusted that whatever he was carrying would find its way to the surface when he was ready. He was 13. He was doing the best he could with a drought and a dead mother and a father who was visibly grinding himself down trying to keep the ranch alive. Which was the thing she couldn't say out loud, because Caleb was doing exactly that, and he knew it, and she knew it, and they both kept moving anyway. He was up before her now, every day. She'd come down at 5 and find the fire already lit, the coffee already on. Caleb gone out to whatever needed doing first. The well check, the fence, the livestock. He came in for meals, and he ate, and he went back out. He didn't complain. He didn't perform exhaustion for sympathy. He just wore it, the way a work coat wears thin, the fatigue showing through the elbows and the collar before the man himself admitted it was there. She watched him, the way she'd watched him since the beginning, learning the vocabulary of his body, the set of his jaw when the numbers were bad, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was thinking about something he hadn't solved yet, the pauses that appeared in his sentences when he was editing something out. "How bad is it?" she asked one evening in the second week of July. The children were in bed. The kitchen was quiet and close, the heat not fully releasing even at 10 o'clock at night. He was at the table with the ledger. He didn't look up immediately. "Define bad." "Caleb." He sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at her. "The livestock won't make it through August on what we have unless it rains. The cash reserve won't cover feed and the account at Pritchett's at the same time. I've got 2 fence lines down on the east side and no lumber to fix them." He paused. "That's the practical bad. The other kind is that 3 families in the territory have already packed up and left this month. Just left. Took what they could carry. Are you thinking about it?" The question landed in the room. Caleb looked at her with a steadiness that she'd come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. "No," he said. "Honest answer." "That is the honest answer." He looked at the ledger. "This ranch it's not just property to me. Rebecca is buried at the tree line. I built this place board by board. My kids grew up in this house." He stopped. "I'm not packing up. I don't care how bad it gets." She looked at him. "Then we figure out the feed first," she said, "and the account second, and the fence can wait." The fence can't really... The fence can wait, she said. Sit down. Let me look at the numbers. He didn't argue. She pulled the ledger toward her, and they sat side by side at the kitchen table with the lantern between them, and she went through the numbers with the same patient attention she brought to everything. And Caleb sat close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, and neither of them moved away from it. They found some room in the numbers. Not much. The territory didn't allow for much, but some. She'd been keeping track of what the kitchen garden might produce, even in the drought, and she'd been trading labor with the Hendersons 2 miles east, mending and preserves in exchange for goods. And that had freed up more cash from the household account than Caleb had realized. It wasn't enough to solve everything, but it was enough to change the arithmetic slightly. And slightly was something. "You've been doing all that?" he said, looking at her notes. It seemed useful. "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." He was quiet, looking at the page. "Eliza, you should have said something before it got... It wasn't a problem before," she said. "It might not be a problem now either. We'll see." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lantern light, his face had shadows in it she'd been watching accumulate over weeks. He looked tired in the deep way. Not a night's sleep tired, but tired in the chest, in the place where you keep the weight of things. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "Do what?" "All of it. The children, the house, the garden, all of it, and not complain." "I complain," she said, "just not to you." "To who?" "The horse, mostly. He's a good listener." Something shifted in Caleb's face. The smile that came was real, small and sudden, the kind that happens when a person forgets for a moment to be guarded. She'd seen it twice before, and she recognized it the way you recognize rare things. She looked back at the ledger. The second week of July nearly broke him. He'd been out before dawn on the Thursday, checking the water situation at the north end of the property, when she heard the sound from the yard. A heavy, wrong sound, the kind that pulls you out of what you're doing without your permission. She went to the door. Caleb was on the ground near the barn. Not fallen. He'd sat down, or perhaps his legs had decided for him, one hand on the barn wall and his head down. And when she got to him, she could see the sweat standing out on his face, even in the early morning cool and the gray color under his brown. "I'm all right," he said immediately, which is what people say when they are not. "You're not." She crouched in front of him. His pulse, when she found it at his wrist, was fast and uneven. "How long have you been like this?" I got dizzy. It's the heat." "It's the heat, and you haven't been sleeping, and you've been doing the work of 3 men for 2 weeks. She kept her voice even. Fear was not useful right now. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then let's get you inside." He made it inside with her shoulder under his arm and went to the kitchen table and sat, and she got him water and made him drink all of it, and then more. And when Will appeared in the doorway at 5:30, rubbing sleep from his eyes, she met him at the threshold before he could see his father's face. "Your father needs rest today," she said quietly. "I need you to take Eli and check the north fence. Sam can do the livestock." Will looked past her. His jaw tightened in the way it did when he was afraid and refusing to show it. "Is he? He'll be fine. He's exhausted. I'm going to sit with him." She put her hand briefly on Will's arm. "You're going to take care of the fence." A beat. Then, "Yeah, all right." She spent the morning with Caleb at the table, then persuaded him to the bedroom in the afternoon, where he slept for 4 hours with the heavy, dead sleep of total exhaustion. She checked on him twice. His color came back. His breathing evened out. She stood in the doorway of his room and watched him sleep, and felt a fear she hadn't fully admitted to herself unwind slightly. The children moved through the house more quietly than usual that day. They all knew, in the way children know things, the whole-body attunement to the emotional weather of a household, that something was wrong and that the right response was to reduce the static. Even May, who had a decibel range in ordinary circumstances that tested the structural integrity of the walls, played quietly in the corner of the kitchen with her counting stones and only asked Eliza twice where Papa was. "Resting," Eliza told her. "He worked very hard." May looked at the ceiling in the direction of the bedroom. "Will he be better for supper?" "I think so." "Good," May said seriously. "Because I want him to see I can count to 14 now. I learned 12 and 13 and 14. "That's 4 new numbers," Eliza said. That's worth celebrating. May returned to her counting stones, satisfied. He was better by supper. Not well. It would take more than an afternoon's sleep to put back what the last weeks had taken. But functional, color restored, the gray gone from under his skin. He came downstairs and sat at the table, and May immediately climbed into his lap and announced the counting achievement, which he received with appropriate gravity, and something in the room went loose with relief. The collective exhale of 5 children and 1 woman who had been holding it in all day. After supper, after the children were settled, Caleb sat on the porch steps in the evening air, and Eliza brought him coffee and sat beside him. Not close exactly, but close. The sky to the west was doing something extraordinary, the setting sun hitting the cloud bank on the horizon and spreading out in layers of orange and deep red, the kind of sky that appeared 2 or 3 times in a summer and never when you had a free moment to look at it. "I need to say something," Caleb said. She waited. "I can't keep doing this alone. I know you're here, and you've been doing everything, and I know that. But I mean—" He stopped, started again. "I've been treating this like I'm still managing on my own, and you're just helping. And that's not what this is anymore. Is it?" The last 2 words weren't quite a question. She looked at the sky. "No," she said, "it isn't. I don't know how to—" He rubbed his jaw. "Rebecca and I built this together from the start. We both knew what it was. This is different. I don't know the right words for it." "You don't have to have the right words," she said. "I want to, though." He looked at her. "You came here with 1 bag and a bad deal, and you've been the thing holding this place together for 2 months, and I haven't told you directly what that means." She felt the familiar internal instinct toward deflection, the practiced skill of diminishing herself before someone else could do it first. She pushed it back. "Tell me then," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. Then, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd manage. Do the work, be decent to the kids, stay. That was all I needed." He paused. "But you're not just managing. You know the difference between Sam being difficult and Sam being scared. You know which step on the stairs is the one Eli jumps on. You know Clara needs to be given room, not pulled in. You know all of it." He stopped. "You learned us. All of us. And you didn't have to do that." The sky had gone deeper now, the orange pulling back into red at the horizon's edge. The dry grass moved in the evening air. Finally, a breath of cool. "I wanted to," she said. Simply because it was true and she was done dressing truth in extra words. He looked at her. She looked back. Between them, in the warm evening air, something settled into a shape it had been working toward for weeks. Something neither of them had named because naming it would make it real, and real things could be broken. But it was real already. It had been real for some time. "I'm glad you're here," Caleb said. 3 words, plain as fence posts. She understood that for a man who parsed his words the way Caleb did, those 3 constituted a declaration. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said. They sat together until the sky went dark and the first stars appeared, not touching, not needing to yet, just occupying the same patch of evening with the easy certainty of people who have agreed on something without the formality of a conversation. 3 days later, against everything the summer had said about what was possible, Eliza went to the kitchen garden in the early morning and found it. A tomato. The left plant. The one Eli said always looked worse. The one she'd watered with the last of the dish bucket 3 nights running. A single tomato, small and imperfect, skin cracked at the top from the irregular watering, not even fully red yet, still carrying some green at the shoulders. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside and called everyone down, all 5 of them, May still in her nightgown and Sam with 1 boot on, and she brought them out to the garden and showed them. The silence that followed was the particular silence of people who have been expecting bad news for so long that good news doesn't register immediately. Then May said, with the full force of her personality, "It's a tomato." "It is," Eliza confirmed. "From the dead garden?" "From this garden, which isn't dead." Eli crouched and looked at it at eye level, then looked up at Eliza with an expression she would keep the rest of her life. "I knew it," he said, like he was announcing a scientific confirmation. "I always knew it." Sam stood with his arms crossed, looking at the plant, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That's actually, yeah, good." Clara crouched beside Eli and looked at the tomato with her careful eyes. And when she looked up at Eliza, there was something in her face that wasn't quite the wall anymore. Not gone, but different. A door in the wall, maybe, left slightly open. Caleb stood behind all of them with his coffee cup. He looked at the tomato and then at Eliza, and the look on his face was not about the tomato at all. That night she lay in her narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the summer still pressing in through the window, but different now. Still hot, still dry, still hard. But something in the weight of it had shifted, the way weight does when you found the right way to carry it. Outside, far off across the flat, dark land, she heard the first sound she'd heard in weeks. That wasn't the creak of the house or the wind in the dry grass. A faint, faint rumble, low and distant, more felt than heard. She lay still and listened. It came again. Then a third time, closer. Thunder. The rain came the way good things sometimes come after long deprivation, suddenly, violently, without apology. Eliza heard it before she felt it. Lying in her narrow bed with the distant thunder still rolling, she heard the first drops hit the roof. Individual sounds, separate and distinct, like a finger tapping on wood. Then more of them. Then the gaps between them closed, and it became a continuous sound, building, and she was sitting up in bed before she'd made the conscious decision to move. And then she was at the window. The rain was coming in sheets across the dark pasture, moving west to east, and in the lightning flashes she could see it hammering the dry grass and the cracked earth and the kitchen garden. And it was real. It was actual water falling from an actual sky. And she pressed her hand flat against the window glass and felt the cold of it on the other side and laughed. Not a polite sound, not a composed sound, but something that came up from somewhere low in her chest and couldn't be helped. She heard footsteps on the stairs, then on the porch. She grabbed her shawl and went down. Caleb was standing on the porch in his bare feet and his nightshirt, looking out at the rain with his arms at his sides. He heard her come out and turned, and in the lightning flash she saw his face, open in a way she'd only seen it a handful of times. The careful management dropped entirely, just a man standing in the rain, smell-watching water fall on his land. "It's real," he said. "It's real," she confirmed. They stood on the porch and watched it come down, and behind them the door banged open and Eli appeared in his nightclothes, announcing that it was raining, as if this were information they lacked, and May appeared behind him, having woken to the thunder. And then Sam came down with his hair sideways and stood at the edge of the porch and held his hand out into the rain and let it hit his palm. Clara came last, quiet as always, and stood beside Eliza and watched the garden without saying anything. Will didn't come down, but later when Eliza went back inside, she passed his room and saw the strip of light under the door. And in the morning his boots were wet. The rain lasted 2 days, not enough to undo everything the summer had done. The land doesn't recover that fast. And the creek came back only as a thin trickle. Not the running water it had been in spring, but the well pressure improved within a week. The grass came back slowly in patches. The kitchen garden, battered by the sudden onslaught of water after months of drought, lost one of the tomato plants entirely, the right one, the stronger-looking one, which struck Eliza as perverse, but the left one, Eli's tomato, the one that had always looked worse, held on. In September it produced 4 more tomatoes. She put them on the supper table on a Tuesday night and said nothing about it, and Eli noticed immediately and pointed and said, "Those are ours," with a proprietary intensity that made Sam snort despite himself, and even Clara looked at them with something that was close to pride. Caleb picked one up and looked at it and set it back down carefully, and when he looked at Eliza across the table, he didn't need to say anything, and neither did she. The tomatoes were small and imperfect and tasted, to be honest, only adequate. Eliza had had better tomatoes in her life, but she ate hers slowly and tasted every bite, and she thought about the cracked soil and the dishwater and the blistered hands and the morning she'd stood in the garden in the worst of July, telling herself it might work. It might, even when she didn't believe it. She thought that sometimes the value of a thing has nothing to do with the quality of the thing and everything to do with what it cost you. The autumn changed the shape of everything. With the worst of the drought breaking, the ranch began to breathe again, not prosperously. Prosperity was not a word that applied to the Boone property in the year of 1878, and probably wouldn't for some years yet. but with the specific stubborn vitality of something that has been tested and has not quite died. Caleb repaired the east fence with lumber he traded for with 2 weeks of labor at the Henderson place. The livestock count stabilized. The well stopped dropping. The garden, encouraged by the September rains, put out a late crop of beans that Eliza preserved in the heavy glass jars she'd found in the cellar, enough to see the household through part of winter. The children grew into the season. Eli turned 9 in October and received, as a birthday gift from Eliza, a proper composition notebook she'd ordered through Pritchett's store, not just for letters but for his theories, which had expanded considerably and now included observations on weather patterns, a hypothesis about why the south pasture tasted different from the north pasture. Well, that was actually not entirely wrong, and an ongoing chronicle of the frog, who had been named Aristotle by this point and was living in considerably better conditions than his temporary resident classification had originally suggested. May turned 5 and could count to 23, which she demonstrated to anyone who remained stationary long enough. She had taken to sleeping with a small braided rope that Eliza had made her one evening from leftover cord. Not a toy exactly, just something Eliza's hands had made while she was sitting and thinking, and May had seen it and wanted it, and Eliza had given it to her without ceremony. She didn't know what it meant to May. She knew May slept better with it. Sam cooked supper by himself every Thursday. This had begun as an experiment and had become, without formal announcement, a standing arrangement. He was genuinely talented in the way some people are talented with their hands, intuitive about heat and seasoning, unhurried in ways he wasn't in the rest of his life. He didn't want praise exactly. He wanted to be taken seriously, which is a different thing, and Eliza took him seriously, and in the evenings after a Thursday supper when the food was good, she'd look at him and say so directly, and he'd look at his plate and say something like, "The pepper needs adjusting," and mean, "Thank you." Clara remained herself, contained, observant, careful, but the door in the wall had stayed open. She brought Eliza small things sometimes, a feather she'd found, a smooth stone. Once, a drawing she'd done on the back of a piece of brown paper, a horse and a house, and what appeared to be the kitchen garden with very deliberate vertical lines indicating, Eliza understood, the tomato plants. She folded it and put it in her dress pocket without making a thing of it, and Clara watched her do this and went back to whatever she'd been doing, and that was enough, and they both understood that. Will turned 14 in November and grew 2 inches and got his father's shoulders. He was not easy. She didn't expect him to be easy. But he'd stopped being on guard with her in the particular exhausting way he'd been in the beginning, the careful monitoring of every interaction for threat. He was just Will now, sharp, responsible, still too serious for his age, carrying things he was learning to put down at intervals. He helped her with the preserving in October without being asked, appearing in the kitchen one Saturday morning and saying, "What needs doing?" in the flat tone that meant he'd decided to do something and was now executing the decision. They worked side by side for 3 hours. He was good with his hands, like Sam, but in a different way. Precise where Sam was intuitive, methodical where Sam moved by feel. They talked some and were quiet some. At one point he said, without preamble, "She would have done this with me, the preserving." Eliza went still for a moment, then kept working. "Tell me about it, how she did it." He did. He talked about his mother for nearly 20 minutes, the longest she'd ever heard him talk about anything, and she listened without steering or consoling, just letting him lay it out. Rebecca Boone had made her preserves with a particular spicing she'd learned from her own mother, adding cloves to the apple butter and a touch of something bitter to the tomatoes that balanced the sweetness. She'd sung while she worked. Not well, Will said, with the candid assessment of a son who had loved his mother without idealizing her, but consistently, the same 3 or 4 songs rotating through all autumn. She'd let the children help more than was efficient because she thought the inefficiency was worth it. "I try to remember her voice," Will said, near the end. "I can still see her face, but the voice it's like a sound you heard in another room. I know what it sounded like, but I can't make it happen in my head anymore." Eliza set down the ladle. She looked at him. "That's one of the harder things," she said. "That happens. It doesn't mean you're forgetting her." He looked at the jar in his hands. "Yeah, she's in how you are with your brothers and sisters, the way you watch out for them." She paused. "That doesn't go away." He didn't respond for a moment. Then he picked up the ladle and went back to work, and after a while he started talking about the fence again, practical and forward-facing, and she followed him there and let the other conversation close naturally. Some things you say once, and then you put them away, and putting them away is not the same as losing them. The formal question of what Eliza and Caleb actually were to each other came up in December, not from either of them, but from the territory itself. A circuit judge named Arthur Beale passed through the area on his quarterly rounds and stopped at the Boone Ranch because Caleb needed a property document witnessed. He was a thin man in his 60s with a dry, professional manner and the specific worldliness of a judge who has seen most configurations of human arrangement and stopped being surprised by any of them. He had been told, apparently, somewhere along the road, the broad outline of the situation, because when he sat down at the kitchen table with his papers, he looked at both of them with a mild, measuring expression. "I understand you're running the household together," he said. "We are," Caleb said. "And you've been calling her your wife around town." "I have," Judge Beale looked at Eliza. "And you're agreeable to that arrangement?" Eliza looked back at him steadily. "I'm agreeable to making it legal, if that's what you're asking." Judge Beale looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Caleb with the level expression of someone who has thought about this and arrived at a position and is presenting it plainly. "We can do it now if you like," Judge Beale said, with the faint amusement of a man who officiates weddings in kitchens at irregular intervals and has stopped being precious about the circumstances. "Takes about 4 minutes." "All right," Caleb said. "All right," Eliza agreed. It took 6 minutes because May insisted on being present and also insisted on counting to 23 as her contribution to the ceremony, which Judge Beale accepted with the patience of a professional. Sam stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, but his eyes were soft. Clara stood beside Eliza and didn't hold her hand, but stood close enough that their arms touched. Eli wept, which surprised everyone, including Eli, who recovered by attributing it to the cold air. Will stood at the back of the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and watched with an expression that had resolved finally into something that was not grief and was not loss, but was simply presence, being there, accepting the shape of things. Caleb took her hand when the judge said to. His hand was warm, and the calluses were in all the same places she'd memorized the night she'd bandaged his knuckle after Red Hollow. He held it firmly, not gently, the way you hold something you intend to keep. Judge Beale signed the papers. Eliza Mercer became Eliza Boone in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and preserved tomatoes and the particular winter smell of a house that has been properly lived in. "Well," said Eli, wiping his face. "That's done then." It was not a romantic wedding. It was better than that. It was true. The years that followed were not easy years, but they were real ones, and the difference matters. There were good winters and winters that nearly broke the budget, and one spring where a sickness went through the livestock and they lost 8 head, and Caleb sat at the table with the numbers for 3 days without sleeping, and Eliza sat with him and didn't offer comfort he couldn't use and instead helped him find the path through. There was a summer when the garden expanded. She started trading produce with 2 other ranching families, a modest arrangement that grew, over years, into something that supplemented the ranch income in ways none of them had originally planned for. There was a year when Sam went away to study in the city, the first of the Boone children to do so, and came back 2 years later with a precision in his thinking that the ranch found good use for, particularly in the books and the trading accounts. Eli grew up and stayed close, built a house a mile down the road, and married a woman named Dora, who was, as Eli explained in his characteristically analytical way, correct for me on most of the important variables, which Dora apparently accepted as a compliment, and Eliza accepted as the most romantic thing Eli was constitutionally capable of saying. He became, of all things, a school teacher, which surprised no one once they thought about it. A man who had been conducting personal scientific investigations and delivering findings to anyone in earshot since the age of 8 was always going to end up in front of a classroom. Clara went to nursing, which also surprised no one. She was precise, careful, good under pressure, and had an ability to be fully present with suffering without being destroyed by it, a combination that is rarer than it sounds. She came back to the territory in her late 20s and set up a practice in a town 20 miles from Red Hollow, and she wrote to Eliza regularly, careful letters with the same measured quality that had characterized her speech since she was 6 years old, and Eliza kept every one of them. May grew up loud and warm and physical and entirely herself, married a cattleman named Joseph Flint, who was quiet in all the places she was loud and loud in all the places she was quiet, which turned out to be an excellent arrangement, and had 4 children she brought to the ranch at Christmas every year without fail, where they immediately occupied the house with the specific maximalist energy of May's children and were allowed to do so, and were loved without reservation. Will was the one who stayed. He was always going to be the one who stayed. Not from obligation. She watched him, over the years, make the choice consciously and deliberately, the way Will did everything, and there was never any reluctance in it. He had his father's quality of finding himself in a place and committing to it fully, the same quality that had made Caleb sit at a kitchen table with the worst numbers of his life and say, "I'm not packing up." By the time he was in his mid-20s, Will Boone was running half the ranch operations and knew the land the way you only know land you've worked in every season. Its soft places and its hard places, where the water came and where it didn't, which fence lines gave trouble every spring and which would hold a century. He married a woman named Helen who matched him in the particular way that suited him, calm, direct, not easily rattled, with a sense of humor she kept on a leash and deployed with precision. Eliza liked her from the first meeting, and Will knew she did, and this mattered to him more than he would ever say, but she knew anyway. Caleb and Eliza grew into each other the way long marriages do. Not without friction, not without the occasional hard conversation or the stretches where they were both too tired for grace, and it showed. He still had the stubbornness she'd identified in the first weeks, the quality of a man who had been wrong about something once and built armor around it. She still had the instinct toward invisibility, the pulled-back quality that sometimes read as coldness when it was actually fear, and which he'd had to learn to distinguish, and didn't always manage to. There were arguments, there were silences that had weight. There was one particular winter, their 8th together, when something between them got strained in a way that took most of spring to repair. And the repair was imperfect, and they both knew it and chose to go forward anyway. That was the thing nobody warned you about, Eliza thought, in the years she turned this over. They had the love. She'd known that for certain since the evening in the gold light on the porch, the summer's first thunder rolling in. But love was not a fixed quantity you stored and drew down. It required maintenance, like the fence lines, like the garden. It went dry in bad seasons and had to be deliberately worked back to life. The difference between people who made it and people who didn't was not the presence of love, but the willingness to keep working it even when the season was bad and the result was not guaranteed. She thought of her father standing on Red Hollow's main street, calling her a burden. She thought of Gerald Payne passing the bread while his mother said terrible things. She thought of the long accumulated education and worthlessness that she'd received from the people who were supposed to know her best. She thought of Caleb saying, "You don't thank someone for doing what's right." She thought of May's sleeping weight against her arm, Clara's measured letters, Sam's Thursday suppers, Eli's notebook full of observations, Will in the barn by lantern light, talking about his mother's voice. The value of a thing has nothing to do with how it starts. The railroad men came in the summer of 1891. There were 2 of them from a company called Pacific Continental, and they arrived in a well-appointed buggy with documents and surveying maps and the particular confidence of men who represent large amounts of money and have found, historically, that this confidence tends to produce results. Their names were Albright and Coles. Albright was the talker, round-faced, well-dressed, with the smooth delivery of a man who has made this specific pitch enough times to have refined it to a precision instrument. Coles was the numbers man, thinner, quieter, who produced figures from a leather folder at the appropriate moments the way a magician produces cards. They wanted the ranch. Not all of it. They explained this carefully, as if the distinction should provide comfort, just the north and east portions, which happened to be the portions the railroad needed for the proposed line running through the territory. It was, Albright explained, a significant opportunity. The territory was growing. A rail line through this corridor would transform the region. Property values along the route would increase substantially for those who retained their holdings, and those who sold early would benefit from the premium pricing Pacific Continental was currently offering, which was, he nodded to Coles, who produced the figure, considerably above current market value. He set the number on the table. Eliza looked at it. It was a lot of money. She was honest with herself about that. It was more money than the ranch had generated in its best years, more money than most families in the territory saw in a decade. She looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at the number 2. His face was unreadable in the way that meant he was reading it very carefully. The north and east portions, Caleb said. That's correct, Albright said. You'd retain the homestead, the barn, the south pasture. That's the creek land, Caleb said. The good land. We'd be keeping the dry side. Well, the survey indicates... I know what the survey indicates. I've worked this land for 15 years. Caleb's voice was level. The north and east portions are where we run most of the livestock in summer. The east fence line is where we get the best grass after rain. You'd be taking the working heart of the property and leaving us the edges. Albright recalibrated. I understand it feels that way, but with the compensation, it doesn't feel that way. It is that way. He pushed the number back toward Coles without ceremony. No. Albright looked at Eliza. In Eliza's experience, men like Albright tended to look at women when men weren't cooperating, operating on the theory that women were more susceptible to large numbers or more easily pressured. She returned his look without expression. Mrs. Boone, he said, I wonder if you appreciate what this figure represents. I can do arithmetic, she said. Of course. I only meant, I know what you meant. She folded her hands on the table. The answer is no. Albright looked between them. He seemed to be reassessing whether the premium pricing had room to grow. We could potentially revisit the compensation. The compensation isn't the point, Caleb said. This ranch isn't for sale. Not the north and east portions. Not any of it. Mr. Boone, I have to be honest with you. The line will go through this corridor regardless. Pacific Continental has the territorial authorization. If we can't reach a private agreement, there are other mechanisms. The room went quiet. Caleb looked at the man across the table with the same expression he'd had standing over Denny Walsh on the road outside Red Hollow. Not angry, not theatrical, just completely and unmistakably clear. Then use those mechanisms, he said, and we'll deal with that when it comes. Today, the answer is no. Albright and Coles gathered their papers. They were not gracious about it, but they were professional, which was its own kind of courtesy. At the door, Albright paused. You should think carefully, he said. This offer. Thank you for coming, Eliza said. They left. The buggy had barely cleared the road before Will appeared from the barn. He'd seen it arrive and had not come inside, understanding that his parents needed to handle it, but he'd been close. He came to the porch where Eliza was standing and watched the buggy go. Railroad, he said. Yes. They'll come back. Probably. He was quiet for a moment. Pa said no? We both said no. He nodded, looking at the road. Good. He went back to the barn without elaborating, and she understood that for Will the entire situation had just been processed, assessed, and filed. The ranch was not for sale. That was the position. Everything else was noise. They did come back. Twice more over the following year. Once with a revised offer. Once with a lawyer and a set of documents designed to suggest that resistance was both legally precarious and financially irrational. Caleb and Eliza met both visits with the same answer and the same steadiness, and eventually Pacific Continental did what large entities do when they encounter genuine, unmovable refusal. They found a different route. The rail line went south through the Alderman property, whose owners had taken the first offer. It was eventually better for the Boone Ranch than the alternative would have been. The southern route carried freight that benefited the whole region, and the Boone cattle had a way to market that hadn't existed before. But none of that was why they'd said no. They'd said no because some things are not for sale, and the list of things that are not for sale is something each person has to work out for themselves, usually through the experience of having sold something they shouldn't have and living with what that cost. Eliza had made a version of that calculation the day she stood in her father's house and said goodbye without looking back. And again every time she'd chosen to stay on the ranch through the hardest stretches of the drought. She had learned to know the value of a thing not by what someone was willing to pay for it, but by what she was willing to go through to keep it. The wooden sign went up in the spring of 1892. It had been Will's idea, practically speaking. He'd pointed out that the Pacific Continental men weren't the only ones who'd come around inquiring about the property since the rail line went through, and a clear statement of position would save everyone time. He'd made the sign himself from a piece of oak plank, planed flat and sealed against the weather, the letters carved deep enough to read from the road. Not for sale. He mounted it on the fence post at the property entrance on a Tuesday morning and came back to the house for breakfast without announcement, and it was Eli, driving up for a visit that afternoon, who mentioned it first. "Nice sign," Eli said, coming in the door and dropping his coat on the chair. "Will's work," Caleb said. "Solid carving. The letters should last." He sat down. "Also, Dora says we're having another one. Third." The conversation moved, as conversations do, and the sign stood at the entrance to the Boone property in the spring rain, and the letters held. Eliza was 63 when she died. It was not a peaceful death in the sense that it was not easy or quick, a sickness in her lungs that came in the autumn and took its time, the way certain things take their time, as if wanting to make sure they are thoroughly finished before they go. She fought it with the same quality she'd brought to everything in her life, not loudly, not with performance, but with the stubborn, head-down persistence of someone who has always preferred to finish what she started. She was in her own bed when it came to the end, in the room that had once been the narrow room with the faded quilt, expanded now. The oilcloth window long since replaced with proper glass that looked out over the north pasture where the grass came back every spring regardless of the previous year. They were all there, all 5 children, Will and Helen, Sam, who had come from the city in 2 days' travel without being asked, Eli with Dora and their 3, Clara, who had ridden through the night, May, who had arrived with Joseph, and all 4 of her children, and filled the house with exactly the particular energy that was May's specific contribution to any room she occupied. And Caleb, who held her hand and did not let go. She was not afraid. She had examined this in the preceding weeks, waiting to find fear, and finding instead something closer to tiredness, and underneath it, a satisfaction that she didn't call contentment, because contentment sounded passive, and what she felt was more active than that. She had done something with the materials she'd been given. She had taken a bad start and made it into something. She had found, in a house full of grieving children and cracked soil and drought-scarred land, the things she'd been told she wasn't capable of providing and didn't deserve to have. She had built something that lasted. "The garden," she said to Caleb near the end. Her voice was thin, but her eyes were clear. He squeezed her hand. "I'll keep it. Don't let Eli's scientific method near it unsupervised." "I heard that," Eli said from the corner, with the particular wounded dignity of a man in his 40s who is still being managed by his mother. She almost laughed. Almost. She looked at the window, the north pasture pale in the autumn light, the old oak tree at the property edge with its branches going bare. She had sat under that tree on a hot afternoon in her second summer here, when the drought was at its worst and she'd needed 10 minutes away from everything. She just sat with her back against the bark and felt the shade and the solid realness of the tree, and thought, this is a good tree. Nothing more than that. Just the simple fact of a good thing being present. Caleb buried her beneath it, as she had asked. He lived 7 years more. Long enough to see Will's oldest daughter take over half the garden, which she expanded in the second year beyond anything Eliza had originally planted. Squash and beans and peppers and 3 varieties of tomato, tended with a focus that Will recognized from his mother and said nothing about except once, to Helen, "She's got it." Long enough to see Eli's second youngest win a county science prize for a project on soil composition that owed more than the boy knew to a notebook full of childhood observations about why the south pasture water tasted different. He sat on the porch in his last years, in the evenings, and watched the light change over the land he'd refused to sell, and thought about the woman he'd paid $125 for on a dusty street because he was out of other options, and she was clearly out of them too, and what had grown from that transaction that no transaction had any right producing. He thought about the tomato plant that had always looked worse and outlasted the stronger one. He thought she would know what to do with that. She would turn it into a theory about people and effort and the misdirection of appearances, and she would tell it to Eli and he would write it in a notebook, and it would be exactly right. She had always been able to see the thing inside the thing, the scared boy inside Sam's scowl, the open door inside Clara's wall, the stubborn life inside the cracked soil. He had bought a woman the town didn't want, and she had turned out to be exactly what the town couldn't offer. Someone who looked at broken things and saw the thing they were trying to become. After his death, the ranch passed to Will, as it always would have. The sign remained at the entrance. Will maintained it the way he maintained everything, with attention and without ceremony. When a letter came from a different railroad company in 1911, he read it at the kitchen table and set it down and said to Helen, "No." And that was the end of it. The sign weathered through the seasons. The letters faded and Will's oldest recarved them in 1914, deeper than before, standing in the rain to do it because the rain had come and she wasn't going to let that stop her, which was a quality Will recognized and did not comment on. People driving the road stopped sometimes, even people who didn't know the history, because there was something about a sign, that simple standing in the wind, that made you want to know the story. And there was always someone who could tell it. The woman sold in a street, the drought that nearly broke the land, the tomato plant that shouldn't have survived, the man who punched a trapper on a road and said no one touches her and meant it for the rest of his life. The story moved through the territory the way true stories move, not in straight lines, not with all the details intact, but with the shape of it preserved. The emotional logic of it, the particular combination of stubbornness and labor, and the refusal to accept other people's accounting of your worth. The oak tree grew older and larger, and the grave beneath it became part of the landscape the way old graves do, returning to the ground, the boundary between the buried and the earth softening with each season. The garden she had started with dishwater and blistered hands spread year by year. In good years, it produced enough to share. In bad years, the people who tended it worked it anyway, because that was what you did, because she had done it, because some lessons are taught not by words, but by the sight of someone getting up before dawn and picking up the yoke. The last image that survives, in the memory of the family and the account of those who knew them, is not of any single dramatic moment. It is of an ordinary evening in the early years of their marriage, Caleb and Eliza on the porch steps in the failing light, not touching, not talking, just side by side with the coffee going cold in their hands, watching the prairie stretch out to the horizon in the last orange light of a day that had been hard, in the ways most days were hard. Not happy, exactly. Not the performed happiness of people who need to prove something, just present, inhabiting their life fully with the awareness of how close it had come to not existing at all, and the quiet, fierce determination not to waste it. That's the thing the sign doesn't say and doesn't need to. That some places hold the memory of the people who chose hard things when easier things were available. That love is not what you feel in the easy season, but what you do when the creek runs dry and the soil cracks and everybody sensible has already given up. That the plant that always looks worse is sometimes the one that lasts.
Dude, the most we could have got per person was 100.
I had a beating heart, bro. I have no clue how much it was worth. I wanted to get it out so bad, but there's 30 million fucking bugs.
The beating hearts were like 60 to 80. Because I think Ben's was 60, mine was 80, I think.
There, alright. Let's go.
Why was it like that?
That was stupid, bro. That's just
I don't know. Why was it all body parts? We made no money because.
Base bitch. Let's all get in that bitch.
No, we need a base bitch, bro.
Says who?
If we didn't have a base bitch, we would have lost right there. Wait, the walkie-talkies. Wait for walkie-talkies.
I don't want to wait.
Ben. Did he run off?
Yeah.
Alright. Well, I guess we'll have an extra one if we all die again. God, man. Why was it all fucking body parts, dude?
I don't know. If it was like a blood moon or something, it makes sense, but I don't
No,
think it was.
just a random moon. Dance goes crazy. Ooh, 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 ooh. I'm just pissed, bro. What was that? Hello.
Hey, it's Billy Points again.
Are you fucking kidding me? Okay, here's what I think we should do. Oh, shit. I'm okay. Grab the most valuable pieces you can find and just put them outside the door, I guess. It's all fucking body parts. This place sucks. Hey, Daddy, if you're talking, you're still muted.
Nah, there's body parts everywhere. I'm just looking for red dots.
Okay, bet. The rib cage worth 24. We just need to find hearts. Why is it all fucking body parts?
I'm just gonna do trips back and forth just to make sure we get something.
Okay, smart.